Part 3, Constantinople. This video is going to be about the relationship between the Vikings and the Byzantines, those that were living in Constantinople. The city of Constantinople was known to the Vikings as Miklagard, meaning the great city. It was built by the Romans originally, and the city was protected by 12 miles of high walls and huge towers, as you can see in this image. Constantinople was a Christian city with many fine churches and other buildings. But again, what would have most attracted the Vikings to the city was the bazaars, packed with exotic goods they'd never seen before. The first Vikings to visit Constantinople was in 839. The Vikings would have come across products here that they had never set their eyes on before, such as wine, olive oil, fruit, and spices. These items they didn't have in their homeland, so for the first time they've seen them, they would have been shocked and excited and looking forward to taking them back home to their family and relatives and selling them in the different settlements in Western Russia. Constantinople, however, was much more turbulent relationship with the Vikings than the Arabs. As you can see here on the graph, this represents the turbulent relationship, and what turbulent means is the relationship was up and down. Sometimes they were trading peacefully, and sometimes the Vikings were trying to attack Constantinople and raid, whereas you could say that this more represents Baghdad, because although they tried to raid Baghdad occasionally, like in 912, it wasn't as turbulent as an up and down a relationship as with Constantinople. They tried to raid Constantinople much more frequently and take over than they did Baghdad. For instance, in 860, Vikings attacked Constantinople with a fleet of 200 ships. With the walls so high, it was unlikely that they were ever going to defeat the Byzantines, the walls that I showed you earlier. It's very difficult to defeat them. However, their violence, although they didn't defeat them, their violence led to trade agreements with the Emperor of Constantinople. And there was many trade agreements that were broken and then new ones that were created. And the Vikings continued to raid and trade throughout the 10th century, even though there were these trade treaties. So many of the trade treaties were established following each time the Vikings attempted to raid. The most significant one, the most memorable of these trade treaties, the trade agreements, was in 945, when it stated that the Vikings could only enter Constantinople in groups fewer than 50 and without any weapons, and they were only allowed a limited amount of silver to trade. However, you'd think this would deter the Vikings and it would ruin the relationship, but actually it didn't. The Vikings continued to trade for many, many years in the city. So although the relationship throughout the centuries between the Byzantines was tempestuous, ultimately they continued to trade successfully, and that's the key point here. In fact, the Vikings as people were so respected as that for their warrior abilities were actually asked by the emperor to join the Varangian Guard, which was their defence of the city. So the Vikings helped to defend the city from any sort of attack. Many Vikings did join the Varangian Guard, and it helped defend the city. And it showed the respect that actually the Byzantines had for the Vikings. So let's look at what the clinching argument would be here. The Vikings were successful at a lot of things. The Volga Vikings were successful boat builders, successful traders. However, the clinching argument here is, therefore, the Volga Vikings' fatalistic attitude and warrior culture meant that they had some successful raids in the east. However, the driving factor in Viking success was trade. It was trade that ultimately motivated them to leave their homelands in the first place. Whilst they were very successful at creating settlements, skilled boat builders and navigators through the long and dangerous journeys, however, trade was the catalyst. What that means is the motivating factor. Without the desire for new goods, Boats may never have been created in the first place, and neither would the settlements in Western Russia have been created if they hadn't left homelands to trade in the first place.